Naja, du verstehst, was ich meine. Ich habe noch ein bisschen kleinere Fragen dazwischen, weil sonst wäre es doch sehr... Naja, oh, verstehst du, jetzt höre ich mich selber. Ich habe noch ein bisschen kleinere Fragen dazwischen, weil sonst wäre es doch sehr... Naja, oh, verstehst du, jetzt höre ich mich selber. Hilfe. Ich habe noch ein bisschen kleinere Fragen dazwischen, weil sonst wäre es doch sehr... Naja, oh, verstehst du, jetzt höre ich mich selber. Guten Abend. Herzlich willkommen.
Hallo.
Hello. Hello, my dear. Hello, Margarethe. Hello, hello, Berlin. And hello, audience. How wonderful that you are watching us tonight, or maybe later on, because you have been Googling for a wonderful book and you came across this talk. An honor to both have you here tonight. I will introduce you later, or let me tell you, you have to introduce yourself. This is a conversation within the realm of a cooperation between the Academy of Fine Arts of Leipzig, CARMA, the Anthropological Research on Museums, Heritage, and us as the Ethnological Museum in Leipzig, part of the State Art Collection. Tonight we're going to talk about a wonderful book, a huge success. It's a huge success. I believe there is no book at the moment who has so many downloads as this book. Across anthropology, troubling colonial legacies, museums, and the curatorial, published by Leuven University Press in the year 2020. And then Corona came, because actually we wanted to do this talk already last year. But now we're doing it tonight, still via Zoom, but we go with the flow. We go with the flow. Tonight I'm going to talk with the two publishers or the editors of this book, Jonas Tinius and Margarethe van Oswald. It's wonderful to have you both here in my virtual living room, you could say, and you're also together, I believe now, at the CARMA, or you're not in the CARMA.
No, actually in my living room.
Oh, you're in your living room. Well, I'm at the museum, but we are in your living room. Margarethe and Jonas, can you maybe tell us something about yourself? I can be very short. My name is Leontien Meijer-Vermensch, and I am the director of the 3 ethnographical collections in Saxony. But who are you?
Yeah, thank you very much, Leontine, for inviting us. Thank you very much also to the Academy of Fine Arts in Leipzig, to Beatrice, to Christina also, who organized all of this here.
And Benjamin.
And Benjamin Meyer-Kramer. So we're really, really grateful to be here and to talk with you tonight. We also consider this more to be a presentation, to be a conversation, not so much of a presentation of our book. So we really want to get in discussion with you. And yeah, my name is Margarethe. I'm based at CARMA, the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage, where I just finished my PhD, which I'm also going to talk about a little bit later on.
Hey, congratulations!
Thank you. Thanks.
Exactly, and I'm the other editor of the book, Jonas Tinius. I'm also an anthropologist, and I spent 4 years in this wonderful research group at CARMA with Sharon McDonald, Larissa Förster, and many other colleagues to whom we're very grateful, because CARMA really was the base out of which we produced this book with Leuven University Press, which was really also a great dialogue. They were really very flexible with producing this book, different ways that we will talk about more, that allowed for flexibility in discussion and yeah, so we're very thankful for that.
Great, great. Since my role as moderator is also to give a bit of promotional context to your book, so I will read a few sentences out loud, because maybe some of the people who are watching us tonight or either later on don't have a clue of what book we are talking about. Reframing Anthropology, Contemporary Art, Curatorial Practice, Post-Colonial Activism, and Museums. That's really a lot, isn't it? How can we rethink anthropology beyond itself? In this book, 21 artists, anthropologists, and curators grapple with how anthropology has been formulated, thought, and practiced elsewhere and otherwise. I really like that sentence. They do so by unfolding ethnographic case studies from Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Poland, and through conversations that expand these geographies and genealogies of contemporary exhibition making. This collection considers where and how anthropology is troubled, mobilized, and rendered meaningful. Wow. I mean, now the audience knows why I so much wanted to talk with you. It's wonderful. Hey, I already sort of teased you a bit about the downloads, but it's really a huge success. My counts, but well, it's still counting. That I read somewhere that there were a few months ago 10,000 downloads, which is for an academic publication, really, you know, it's a huge success. And my question to you would be, who reads this book? Who are your downloaders? Did you do some research about it? Is it our sort of critical museum curatorial studies bubble, or is it also in the museum field? Is it also the larger museum field?
So I think that it's actually really what we're hoping also now, who our audience is tonight. So really at the crossroads between museum scholars, anthropologists, but also curators, and we kind of try to establish a dialogue between these sometimes a bit fragmented fields, one could say, and to bridge gaps between these different fields by inviting, on the one hand, academics to write, as well as academic curators, and also trying to invite an analysis that would go beyond these kind of separated fields.
And I think something else to add that was very important for us is that the book really, while of course it is an academic book in the end that can be read and used in different kinds of ways, it began from field work. And I think that's something very important for us. These are not just journalistic interviews, they were interviews with people that we consider fundamental interlocutors of a field that was shared. And I think that's really an important point to mention, because the way that we worked in CAMA and the Making Differences project that was funded as part of Sharon McDonald's Alexander von Humboldt Professorship allowed not just the three of us within a sub-research section called Transforming the Ethnographic to work together, but for us to observe different institutions as they change, as they are being troubled by different agents, by different collectives, by different initiatives. And it struck us just to understand these initiatives, these fields, artistic, activist, curatorial, to see them not just as it were, extra museal fields, but to see these as particularly important in what happens right now and why museums are being rethought, especially anthropological ones. And so the reason we also then decided to do this book open access was, of course, we were able to do so thanks to CAMA, thanks to Leuven, thanks to the Humboldt University that supported this book, which has now been downloaded 25,000 times, actually. So
even more gigantic even more numbers. Wow.
Which of course are just numbers on the one hand, but this means that the book can be shared and used for teaching. And that was particularly important for us, because open access is, of course, a wider political movement, as it were, to decenter academic presses. But also really we wanted the book to be able to be cut up, used in different ways, to be retranslated, to become modular, as it were. So these interviews We use them in teaching. They are being used in different university settings and art settings. And that was really what we hope to achieve in terms of reaching audiences across institutionalized and non-institutionalized fields.
Wonderful. Reflecting on crossing boundaries, I hope we also do this tonight. And we all three, we urge our audiences to really proactively start this conversation with us. It's not me interviewing those wonderful people, but it's really us together with you coming into a hopefully fruitful dialogue. So please feel free to ask whatever questions, remarks, reflections you have, and we will try to integrate it in our setting. So you don't have to wait 45 minutes before you can enter the question in the chat, or activate your questions in the chat, but you can already start from I would say now, or no, you agree, right? Yeah, great. Could you maybe say a bit more about this collaborative research you did with Karma? Because I think it is very innovative, what you did there within the sphere of Karma. And was it also a space to have more liquid borders between the academic critique and the academic practice? And do you think you succeeded in that?
Maybe we can answer that by actually referring to how this book really came about. I mean, to talk a little bit about the genesis of these ideas, because what happened was that Sharon had created Karma to operate, or the Making Differences project to operate in different subfields, as I already mentioned. And one of these, Transforming the Ethnographic, had invited me, myself, Margareta, and Larissa Förster to work on not just the transformations of ethnographic collections and museums, but also on the flip side of that, what it means for us as anthropologists to work ethnographically. So how our engagement with the changing ethnographic collections and changing ethnographic museums necessitates a different kind of approach to the field. And I think I would maybe at this point invite you, Margareta, to speak about your field work, because it showed in some ways a segue into why we started working together on this book.
Oh yeah, that would be wonderful.
Well, basically, I started fieldwork in the museum, in the Ethnological Museum itself, in 2013. Here in Berlin, trying to understand the ongoing transformation of the landscape of ethnological museums in Europe, more generally speaking, especially with regards to the ways in which they were being somehow criminalized. So being always, at one point, Okwi Envisor, who I talked to, he said that ethnographic museums, they always get it wrong. So I wanted to understand what this getting it wrong meant. And so entered the museum to understand, in the process of the moving exhibitions to the Humboldt Forum, how curatorial practice articulated and what curators were actually doing in that very polarized situation. And realized at that point that I felt that they were somehow being framed and also limited by that particular Humboldt Forum, and actually that their capacities to act within that framework were very limited in a way. And so when we started talking, Jonas and I, who was doing fieldwork related more to contemporary art, which is a field where I originally came from, we realized that there were other places beyond these kind of traditional anthropological institutions that were doing work which dealt with similar questions, but in a more publicly efficient way, one could say. So this is kind of how our conversation really started with regards to these transformations of anthropology, but also the museums and questions that were raised by them. So maybe you could also elaborate a little bit what you were working on in order to understand how then we came together and kind of developed argument of this book.
Yeah, and also to explain the title of the book, because across anthropology, of course, means on the one hand through anthropology, but it also means beyond it. And beyond it, in this case, means beyond the institutions and beyond the canons that we know, beyond the institution of the museum, of the archive, of the institute. And in my fieldwork, which was more concerned with contemporary curatorial practices in the field of contemporary art, I realized, and this was frequently a point of contention between myself and various interlocutors within the field in Berlin and beyond, was that anthropology had become somewhat unmoored. So it had become it had gotten a life of its own, in the sense that it was being talked about, problematized, discussed in various biannuals and various art spaces and various exhibitions. And of course, in ways that were critically looking at its colonial entanglements, at its histories, at its problematic modes of writing, the sort of writing culture legacy, but also in variously productive ways that allowed the anthropologist to become a sparring partner or a conversational interlocutor, again, in curatorial practice, and to think about ways in which anthropology beyond itself then can be in dialogue with curatorial practice, with artistic practice, to think about issues not just of representation, but of structures and modes of dealing with objects, subjects. And so this was really what motivated us and was what brought us together to tackle this with interviews with curators in particular.
Would be interesting to reflect a bit on that with our students of the Academy of Fine Arts and the curatorial master that they are doing. So that fits also very well. And we will be speaking tomorrow with the students also, and we'll be tackling this, right? But I did not want to interrupt you, Margarethe. I'm sorry.
No, because I did want to come back to your question of the relation between praxis and theory, in a way. And I think what we really try to do is when we worked in the field, basically doing our field work, both of us kind of resigned from this role of the anthropologist as being a distant observer, but both of us decided to actively participate also in the processes that we were involved in, that we were kind of, the people that we basically worked with the people that we also wanted to write about. And so I myself got involved in curating an exhibition as part of the Humboldt Lab. Jonas also became part of several discursive formats and started to work also on a curatorial level. And so these borders also somehow crossed. And I think it enabled us, and I can say that about myself with regard to the Ethnological Museum, of not having this kind of bashing mode anymore. So what I think is very common with regards to ethnological museum practice and exhibition making is that it's very easy to criticize them and to find points that didn't go right somehow. With this idea in mind, also they always get it wrong, but then also realizing how difficult it actually is to work productively and curatorial within these spaces. And I think,
And I think at the same time to do something that was very relevant for us, and you read out this one sentence, we wanted to look at where and how anthropology, which to some extent is dealing with questions of difference, with questions of racialization, of Europeanization, also in a self-critical way, and has really become a field in which a lot of these issues of sovereignty are being productively discussed. And we wanted to see to what extent we could fill anthropology, and we will come back later, I think, also to why we use that term in particular, with different kind of meaning, and not to let certain kind of terms just in an unmoored way float around and become empty signifiers, but to try and engage and therefore also fill that term with meaning again. So in some ways, while the book might be interpreted as perhaps an attack on, that's perhaps a little bit too extreme, but as a criticism of an institutionalized form of anthropology, we're actually trying to engage in this mode and to try and say, hey, listen, there is a different way of engaging anthropologically with curators, with artists, and to see conceptual work that is being done in exhibitions as a form of practice and theory building at the same time, that is both relevant for us as anthropologists and for museums that deal with anthropology and its legacies.
And I think one aim was also to, because when I worked in the museum, I felt some sort of absence of current anthropological theory making and research. So there was this kind of, I felt this gap sometimes between research that was really happening and, as you said, extremely relevant, but that didn't really appear in the ways in which I would have wished for. So I was looking for places where anthropology was being negotiated and productively shown and also made available to a broader public. And I think this is also something that we were really looking for, is where in anthropological museums does anthropology actually still play a role, and how can it be relevant? Because we kind of love this discipline, even though it is so problematic. So we were thinking, and the kind of outcomes that this research produces. But we did feel that that other places than the traditional institutions were somehow more productively engaging with them.
Well, it reads as a sort of discursive love story in a way, right? I mean, you're really trying to engage and also bridge the gap between, I would say now, very polarized field. At least when you read the feuilleton, it seems like a very polarized field. You are talking about bridging and maybe also sort of lacking a sense of discursive critique within the field itself, but you deliberately interview people like Wayne Modest, who is in both worlds, Nanette, who is, I think, Nanette Stoep, the director of the Rotenstag Joost, formerly director of this institution, but also somebody is like Clementine de Lis, who is in itself very transdisciplinary. And they're also all working in institutions. So there is also, I think, within the museum field, a renewal and a more theoretical reflection on the museum, or are it all outsiders, or are they all coming from somewhere else? Question mark.
No, I think this is exactly what we try to understand within these institutions, but also outside of them. How were people engaging with anthropology and its legacies? And that didn't exclude I mean, we did then find examples such as Clementine de Lis's practice, for example, in the Weltkulturmuseum in Frankfurt, who explicitly used an anthropological concept, the concept of remediation by Paul Rabinow, to really set a new start in this museum. So
can you maybe open up that concept for everybody who's not immediately aware of it?
Yeah, so Clementine de Lis, she was the director of the Frankfurt Weltkulturmuseum for between 2010 and 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and she basically used this concept of remediation to reframe the objects and the collections, and inviting all kinds of people, including artists, including scholars, including lawyers, including, really a wide range of people, to try to free the objects from their kind of monodisciplinary attributions, I would say. And she tried also to open very explicitly the storages of the museum, because I think one of her convictions is that what also, when one works in a museum, one realizes that it's about 5% in general of the objects that are being exhibited and given access to. And so she really wanted to open up the museum in order for people to do research within the museums, and thus to allow these objects to take on new meaning and new significations.
I think for me, also getting inspired, what Clementine with her concept derived very strongly from anthropology, puts in action is not reflecting on giving access, but also very self-critical, self-institutional critical about who grants access. And what does that mean? Who grants access in this field? Can you relate to that? That for me, as a museum director, also is so enormously important.
I think on the one hand, granting access is obviously a key issue, which, as many people have pointed out, is not just a representative question, but a structural one of who creates programs, who hires personnel, and who is within these kinds of institutions. And that itself already generates a different kind of question of access. But I think we wanted to say something else too, which is that all these different kinds of debates that we witness, the challenging of the discipline, the challenging of the names, the renaming of professional associations, the renaming of museums, they are all part of a movement that is important to understand. It's a phase that we want to take seriously with this book. And the challenge, or also the bashing, is also part of it. This is part of a vibrant discussion that we should, as it were, take seriously and see as a productive moment in which we should try to understand where the energy, as it were, is coming from, but not just who is willing to transform anthropology. That's one side of it. That's one of our interests, but also to say who is refusing on what grounds to cooperate with what kinds of institutions, who is refusing what kinds of terms, and what is being proposed alternatively. So, that's a reference to an interview that we did with Natasha Jeanwala, who generously spoke with us for a long time, and we tried to reproduce as much as we could from this idea that there is something generative in refusal. There is something generative in not accepting certain terms, not accepting certain corporations, and they shouldn't always be read as an existential rejection, but as an invitation also think what went wrong in cooperation and what went wrong in work together, which is also why our interview with Bonaventure Sobejeng-Dikong from SAVI began with a question back at us saying, why should I talk about anthropology, and who's watching whom at this point? Part of whose legitimate work am I speaking here? So all of this is part of the movement that we wanted to grasp with this book.
It's so timely also, even 1 year after lockdown, I must say. We have the first question. Shall we have a look together? I'm not sure if you can read it also.
I can.
You can? Great. Well, first of all, Elisa Smit, thank you so much, because it's always so difficult to be the first one. So thanks for sharing your question. Could you elaborate more on the difference between anthropology and the anthropological? And what would you describe as anthropological methods? And also, what could the anthropological and the trans-anthropological mean for other fields of exhibiting? I'm going to take a sip of water so we can all think about that wonderful question. Thank you, Elisa. You are not the first one to ask a question, but it's immediately very interesting one. Who wants to start?
I'm happy to kick it off briefly as a moment, because I think this first distinction that Elisa pointed out here, and thank you also for the question, is really fundamental for us between anthropology, perhaps with a capital A, we elaborate this in the introduction, and what is associated with it. So anthropology is a discipline with its own history, with its own canon, with its own institutions, its own methods, and so on. And what we noticed was, and I think a lot of us have, and people have been writing about this, is that ethnographic methods, fieldwork, anthropology, again, have become, and I mean, already Hal Foster wrote about this kind of relationship between art and anthropology, and the envy between, or also the rejection of it. It has become a term that in some ways has come to stand in for a lot of different things and a lot of different meanings. And we were interested in understanding, where do anthropological modes of inquiry, so anthropological modes of inquiry that employ certain kinds of methods, such as longer term fieldwork, such as this very fundamental idea of ethnographic theory that emerges not just from an unmoored theoretical canon somewhere, but actually from within situated concepts. Where do such modes of thinking exist outside of the capital A anthropology? Well, and the answer is in a lot of different fields and in a lot of different areas of inquiry. Does such an anthropological mode of inquiry, an anthropological mode that for us at least is very fundamentally based in the premises of the writing culture debate, so an anthropological mode that inquires itself and its own modes of writing, and that sees its own failures and so on. And to try and grasp this, we kind of just use this term trans-anthropological, again, in the same way as across, to try and describe these fields not as non-anthropological, but to say that there is anthropological modes of thinking and inquiry that we should take seriously and that are very important and interesting for us. They're not just empty signifiers. That's what we try to speak to with these terms.
And I think exactly the kind of modes that Jonas just referred to are central also beyond in exhibition practice beyond anthropological museums. So what you refer to as this kind of self-critique and really trying to reflect on the conditions of knowledge production, for example, I would say this is something that is valid across and beyond all kinds of museums and curatorial practice. And I think this is also something that is being taken as a productive kind of means to produce knowledge within these institutions.
And it also, go ahead.
No, you.
It raises a question also for you, Leontine, because you know, the interesting thing for us in these interviews, especially, we asked various museum directors and curators somewhat similar questions because we were curious to see how people responded. And one of the things that we noticed that was important for us was that anthropological framings, there were certain types of framings that people might identify as problematically or productively anthropological. So modes of exhibiting, specific display techniques, modes of writing, labels, and so on. And we asked what for people was such an anthropological framing. And it's interesting that you notice them, again, not just within anthropological museums. So in some ways, this is also a question for you. You know, what would you actually consider to be either a problematically or a typically anthropological framing of an exhibition?
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned already so much what resonates so deeply. So first of all, the whole turns and the positionality. So you can't do museums anymore without this positionality, which is of course fundamentally anthropological. But I would say which museum is at the moment not doing or working with this anthropological methodological toolbox. And I see it more and more in cultural history museums. At cultural history museums, and especially the ones situated in a sort of city museum realm, have become or have gone through a fundamental epistemological change from history museums to city museums that very much work as anthropological museums. And for example, the Amsterdam City Museum, which was a cultural history museum, has even changed its name because of that it's not the Amsterdam Historical City anymore, but it's the Amsterdam Museum. And it's very much about the now. And it's very much about museums are not neutral, and it's very much about participatory strategies and methods. So I would say that because of the whole debate that has been going on in the anthropological museum world, this backpack, this toolbox has fundamentally changed, I think, a lot of curating in all kinds of museums, whether they're cultural historical ones, but also those that are so interesting and seldom looked upon, namely natural history museums. Even those museums have changed by what is going on in our field, which I find enormously important. And that's why I hope that your book is being read by so many more people across the museum's sectors, and as well, that also people that come from other museum fields will read this book. And my question, and then I come to the question that Fred, because now I see that my dear colleague Fred has posed a question for you both, is how can I, as a director, because I'm of course not so much in curatorial practice anymore. I'm now in this decision-making management position. So how can I open a frame where all this that you talk about can also fundamentally change the institution, and not only by exhibition making, but fundamentally change the institution as it is. And that's of course front office, but also very strongly back office. That's why I'm so intrigued by this whole concept of the back office of the museum in changing that. But of course also in the context of who speaks for whom, and diversifying, etc., etc. So I noticed that I more and more reflect on those questions that you just asked me out of a managerial director perspective. And that's my critique to the book. Although I love all the people you asked to write an article, and also the people you interviewed, but you interview them very strongly from a curatorial perspective. And a lot of them are directors and are in this position of power. And what does that mean in the framework of what this book is all about? Maybe that's a question for later, but first, Fred, wow, thank you, Margarethe and Jonas, for making explicit your theoretical. Coming back to your introductory remarks, I like your pointing out the double notion of across in the sense of through and beyond, as well as your explanation that you consider your book being part of a larger field work, thereby considering your interviewees as your interlocutors. With this in mind, could you explain why you so specifically focus on the term anthropology and anthropological? How do you relate to the term ethnographic, as in your collaborative research project, transforming the abnormal? How does across and transform relate to one another?
Thanks, Fred.
And Clementine de Lis is also watching. Hey, Clementine, good to see you. Or not, it's good to read you. Well, this is a very Fambocious question that I first need to think, what is he actually saying? So I'm taking another sip. It's really just water, you know. Not to ruin my already ruined reputation, but could you maybe start answering the questions, plural, of Fred?
Yes, I mean, first of all, thanks, Fred, for saying these things. And I maybe one segue into this is actually a belated response to something that you just pointed out, Leontine, the renaming of museums from the historical to the city museum, which points to the fact, on the one hand, that museums are more and more perhaps realizing the co-constitutive effect of museums within society, rather than relying on an idea of representation and conservation, even though, of course, one might argue that history, of course, is itself performative in the way that we represent history, which is, of course, exactly the debate that your dear colleague in the City Museum in Berlin, Paul Spies, has been engaging with. But I think that brings us also to Fred, to your first point. I mean, the across and through, the meaning of across as both through and beyond. And this is precisely, I mean, there's another, sorry, this is what I wanted to say. There's another kind of meaning that Sharon McDonald pointed out, because if you read out the title, Across Anthropology, being cross with also means being somewhat in dispute, perhaps, or in argument, being even perhaps a little bit angry or annoyed. And I think, again,
but still very diplomatically phrased, like we know and love Sharon. I mean, there's a critique, but still, she's a diplomat, right? Or state.
Exactly. And so this was really important for us to deal with these conflicts in a way that would allow not just the refusal of certain kinds of terms, but to try and find modes of conversation. I think that was important for us, and to try and find ways in which, through and beyond anthropology, we can talk about a shared set of fields without necessarily coming back always to certain kinds of silos. And I think this was also part of the long conversation that we had with Clementine, actually, over clear drinks that were not water. Cheers to you again. Thanks for that long conversation with you. So to get out of, as it were, the silo thinking, while at the same time understanding the importance of certain kinds of civic institutions. So we didn't want to open up a kind of central institutions versus peripheral institutions, but to try to get towards thinking, to try to think about curating and anthropological modes of inquiry as ways of thinking about difference, as ways of thinking about the troubling of heritage and the generation of new concepts. So I think that was important for us, and hence also relying on anthropology and anthropological, because we didn't want to just, as it were, put on a fixed leaf on top of the discussion and say we just invent a new term and we move somewhere else and then we're fine. But to actually try and really tackle it, to try and rest with the term for a moment and try and make it meaningful in some ways again. And this has to do with transforming the ethnographic. So transforming the ethnographic, as I said right at the beginning, means on the one hand, understanding the important transformations of the logos of ethnos in museums, understanding the important transformation of how we consider a collection to be ethnographic, or whether that's even the right term, and thereby understanding that the mode in which we as anthropologists engage, not just with these collections, but in general with knowledge production and fieldwork, has to change as well. So it's across anthropology, also in the sense of across fieldwork and beyond much hackneyed understandings of fieldwork.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. It's also the joy of thinking more anthropological, right? I mean, there's also I mean, it's deep and highly footnoted. As a Dutch person, I would say it's also a very German book, you know, with all those footnotes dropping out of the book. We always make little jokes about that. Oh, a very German book. But it's and on the one hand, it's also very lightish. And was that also sort of reclaiming this highly contested field, and trying to, you know, give it proactively a new relevance, a new meaning, a new identity?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I didn't understand that. That's a question.
No, it was. And I think the lightening up, it's funny that you mentioned the footnotes, because actually one of the longer discussions we had with the publisher was actually not just about, you know, not accepting just the very basic open access license, but we spent quite some time leafing through the different CC BY licenses to really allow for one that would allow us to paste and reshuffle the book in as many ways as possible. But we also decided for the book not only to have a set of sort of visual constellations towards the end of the book in I think very nicely printed sort of matte colors that they really managed quite well, but we, instead of an index with a PDF, which doesn't make so much sense because everybody can really just search their own terms, we decided to compile what we called some lists to inspire the reader. And these are a list of words and concepts that we thought were particularly relevant to the conversations. But in addition to that, and this is really where it's also useful, we created over a painstaking process, a chronological list of all cited exhibitions and a list of cited institutions and organizations in the book. so that actually it can become useful for you if you're interested in a certain kind of institution or in a certain kind of exhibition, to try and look and see where they are being discussed in the book, because of course they have become central reference points across a number of different conversations and fields. So that was another. That's why I'm kind of pointing to the very German book. We tried to also poke a little bit at the
and also to really
list.
underline and highlight the long histories of these debates, because we're of course not the first and only ones who have been discussing these questions in a very detailed manner, but it's been a very, very long debate. And I think especially the list of exhibitions shows this history very well, because each of these exhibitions try to grapple already with these questions of cultural difference, of us and them, etc. So yeah, so I think this is really something that we try to document also, and to show also with regards to the organizations, that it's very much also activist critique who has contributed to making this debate so publicly relevant today. And not only citing art institutions, be they small or big, but also saying that there's a lot of very often very precarious and unpaid labor that has gone into this, and which enabled this critique to be so present today.
Yeah, no, that's a good and also ethical point to stress. That's true. You're so right, Margarethe. I'm so happy with our audience. It's unbelievable. Erika, hi, wonderful to read your question. Oh, they can they go there now. So I have to scroll up. Sorry. I love the early mention of anthropologists not only doing the easy, harsh critique of museums, but what changes when they think with them, curatorial dreams. Love how many discussions this traveling book continues to open with a diverse set of interlocutors. Yeah, that's beautiful. What does that mean? Changes when they think with them. Can you maybe open up that a bit more? Or do you think it was more a comment of Erika? I'm not sure. Maybe it was more a comment. What do you think?
I think it's a provocation, and I think it's something that we take seriously. And I think it's something that you do and that Clementine does in the comments that we see following Erika's comments here. And so maybe we'll get to that point in a moment. But I think what I wanted to pick up was, because Erika Lehrer, who contributed a wonderful article to this book as well, points out that what was really important for us was that this is not a conclusive kind of summary or observation about the field, but actually it was deliberately, on the one hand, an ethnographic moment that we speak about, observations across our field. It was an outcome deliberately and explicitly out of collective research at CAMA. It's also a provocation. It wants to institute, it wants to iterate. And our idea really of these different kinds of conversations is to investigate precisely the kinds of relationships that we were interested in following in the book. So we kind of consider all of these conversations as iterations of this moment, of this across anthropology moment, in which we go beyond the institutions, we go in conversation with Beatrice von Bismarck and the MA Cultures of the Curatorial, and we go into conversation with different kinds of people in different settings. We teach the book, we teach it in art schools, in anthropology courses. So it's really an attempt to try and get a different kind of conversation that is across fields going.
I'm now thinking out loud, and maybe it doesn't make sense, but I wanted to bring it up anyway. Is it also because you, from CAMA or as a researcher as such, you're as implicated in discursively as I am in this museum field? So bringing up this not so much implicated subject, but this idea of Erika's, the implicated community. I mean, we have to do this together, right? And with many others as well.
I think that's what collective fieldwork in a city means. I mean, that's also what I understand Erika's comment to mean, that when you are not just bashing museums, but changes when you try to think with them or work in them or work through them, as Margareta points out. And that's what we noticed. If you're in the same city doing collective research with about 20 people on changing institutions, of course you encounter one another, and you can't really escape being part of that field very explicitly yourself. And I think that's not something to run away from, but that's something to explicitly address, which is what we try to do in the book. So I think that's also part of the ethical responsibility of taking that situatedness seriously. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I really think
for you, actually, Leontina.
Yeah, because I was also very interested in that question. So maybe we can jump to that one. So
is there a question for me? Oh, then I have to
Clementina is asking at the very end.
Can you speak, Leontina, about how far you are ready to go to switch backstage to front? Feel Grassi with the collections so people can study them, move some around? Yeah, that's a good Clementine-ish kind of question. It's also a bit across in the sense of critique. I have to take a sip of water and think. What we start with, which will open on the 2nd of November, and it's the first opening of a series of openings till at a certain moment in time, hopefully end of 23, beginning of 24. We will not have a new exhibition, but be another museum, a new museum, also with a new name. And one of our first spaces is called Backstage. It's of course now a working title, where we together with the public indeed try to think this backstage museum work in a front of exhibition space, and I think at a certain moment during that process of reinventing ourselves, it will probably be so as Clementine writes, that Feel the Grassi with the collections so people can study them and move some around. Yeah. That would be wonderful. But what does that imply? I think there you really come very close to be this more liquid institution, where all these boundaries between front and back, and between us and them, and between us and other kinds of museums, between us and other kinds of heritage institutions and communities, become so much more lucid. And I like that. So I hope you will all come at the 2nd of December or in the months after, and start this process with us, because we can't, of course, do it alone. But yeah, in its consequence, it is that radical, and I'm looking forward to that. I'm not sure if that's the answer that Clementine wanted to hear, but I'm looking forward. I believe I said the 2nd of November, but it's the 2nd of December. So in a few weeks we will open, but we will invite all of you and of course make it more public.
Clementine, we also have a second computer here open, so we see the different comments. So if there is more feedback and back and forth pinging, we will be able to see it. And I think one actual other question that has just been copied is from Erica again, that has just come in, exactly. And maybe Do you want to read that out, or should I?
Maybe you can also, because otherwise I'm the one who only reads out loud. You probably are a very beautiful read out louder as well, right?
Well, first of all, I think Clementine, because she's just in the middle of writing something, says, "Great, don't let conservation rule the game." So there we go.
Clementine, yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
So Erica writes, anthropology was born as a museum discipline. What this book asks for me is, can there be a museum anthropology that does more than critique these dusty institutions and bring the new, updated, self-reflexive and self-critical anthropology and do something productive with them? A postmodern, decolonial, museum-based anthropology, for example, curating rather than only writing today's anthropology.
Beautiful question again. Wow, we have such good questions. I'm really yeah, and my question to take that one to make it more concrete in my head is to go beyond the semantics, because it writes so sexy, right? What you're saying, but what does that really mean in curatorial practice? That is something that I am struggling with. Actually, I'm quite struggling with a lot of semantics. When I hear certain people, I won't say any names, they talk about the same concepts as I do, and that you are dealing with, and by is it trying to neutralize these concepts by using them at openings, for example. There was a recent opening somewhere in Germany. Is it instrumentalizing them? But I felt after hearing these terminologies that I thought, do I need to find a new language? So I really had, I really felt frustrated. And then I thought, fuck discourse, you know, Leontine, put it into practice. I mean, that's what you do, right? Put it in curatorial practice. And then you hopefully will see the difference between talking and actually doing it. So that's now at the moment our flow here. It's not only me but also others, because I really felt frustrated by that, because everybody is now talking about multifocality and well, all the jargon, and do we need new jargons, or do we need to break them down and making it more more concrete?
But I think that what you said, I think there's several questions in there. But as you said, I think it's not only changing the way in which we curate these collections or work with these collections, but also, as you said beforehand, of changing the kind of back-end structure in order to be able to really change representation. And I think this is really where the biggest challenge lays. But exactly as Erica said, I think, so how do you make the up-to-date anthropological discourse enter into the museum? And I think one example we have in the book is a discussion of the exhibition Persona in the Musée du Quai Branly, which was taking one very pressing issue, namely that of the distinction between object and subject, which is a very vivid discourse in anthropology as its point of departure to really create an exhibition that used the collections and made something different with them, and also in a way that was reaching broader audiences and trying to make this anthropological theory making very relevant. And so I think this is also what we try to do, and of course also Clementine's practice. I think this is a similar example of how to bring ideas very central and essential in anthropological academic discourse into practice in a way. Yeah, so I think that this bridge, we try to find example, and also the conversations we have with Wayne Modest are similar. He also brings up examples of exhibitions where you really try to go beyond the kind of disciplinary frameworks and borders that are somehow imposed by working with 19th century collections, but then trying to make something new with these collections.
But I think Erika's point really is absolutely key, and quite frankly, this Wohnzimmer conversation across digital Wohnzimmers is precisely what this is aiming at. It's trying to suggest to have these conversations within the realm of a museum, within the realm of a space that thinks about all the practicalities and all the administrative necessities and all the diplomatic necessities around it, but to try and say, hey, but there is still the need for us to stay up to date with what conversations are, what concepts are being discussed in what ways, because otherwise you constantly end up having this lag across institutions. And that, of course, is the result of decades of institutionalization that doesn't permit this kind of permeability between theorizing, but also of fieldwork. Again, I think that was so important for us to say, if you do field work within these spaces, we do field work with curators and on museums, you suddenly begin to realize a lot of issues on both sides. So precisely the issues within the institution, but also you begin having a greater understanding of the dynamics of certain fields that are becoming ever more relevant. So the ability to connect conversations between activist challenges and theoretical development, for example. I think that's something which is absolutely fundamental, to try and understand that, theoretical discussions are not just in a realm that is purely discursive, but that they are performative, and that they're born out of very, very situated contexts. That theory is itself a situated practice. And I think that's really relevant for us.
And I think what you said with regards to questions of language, I think Fred is probably one of the experts in that kind of the emptiness of certain terms today. And I witnessed a kind of conversation recently where George Shire, who is a British cultural theorizer, said that just because we talk a lot about decolonization doesn't mean that we're actually doing it. And I think you're very right in what you said, that it's actually now coming down to what actually is being done within these institutions and not what is being said about them or through them. So I think we're very excited to see what you're going to do, and to see how this moment actually articulates in different museum institutions, because everyone has now understood what is going on, but now it's really about what to do with that, with the questions that are being raised.
Yeah, and also knowing that we are, and as everybody is also only cooking with water, because we can't cook with anything else. Yeah, maybe with bouillon, but again, Erika, and I'm such a fan of Erika, has a question, or maybe again a comment, but we can then maybe reflect a bit on her comment. Thinking about how objects are categorized in the back end of museums in taxonomies, can we ask in a new way who are a giving objects community? Yeah, this allows them to occur new meanings and new communities of care, very beautiful, without cutting their ties to and rights of original owners. This opens to their travels, their difficult histories, their new resonances. Very much also, of course, in the article in your book of Erika Lehrer's own research. Yeah. Also, this, of course, also resonates very much with my former everyday practice in the Jewish Museum in Berlin. So it's.
This is a very powerful comment in itself, but perhaps this, in a very different way, allows us to address one other issue, I think, that is central to the book. And I'm also thinking towards the students we will meet tomorrow and what we can continue to discuss. But we chose in the book institutions and scholars, activists, practitioners situated in Europe. And that was a very deliberate choice that we made, because we felt that precisely this idea of communities of implication implies not just those directly affected by the theft of objects, but it also bestows not just an incredible responsibility, but a responsibility of taking seriously the role of difficult heritage for European institutions and scholars. So it was really, I mean, that's why the subtitles Troubling Colonial Legacies is not just about the ways in which we trouble the colonial legacies within museums, but also to understand that troubling, awkward, difficult heritage is a very important problem around which we need to discuss what Europeanization means, what European difficult heritage means in the future, and what to do with these institutions and collections. So again, it's really a call to say, this is the most important moment right now, and to take this seriously is absolutely of utmost importance.
Yeah, it's also a very important quote of Wayne in his statement. Like,
exactly, museums as investments in critical discomfort.
Yeah. There are a lot of beautiful, and it's not about. I mean, quotes are sexy, but they're, of course, without context, they also lose their meaning. But in their context, they're really beautiful pearls or diamonds, and that was one of them. If you would make a second book, what would you do? What is still lacking, or what have you learned from this book? I mean, what was your learning moment till now of this book? What would you do differently, apart from inviting other very nice German Dutch museum directors in Germany? No, I was not hinting to that point. I was hinting to what would be the second volume?
Well, we are actually working on a book.
I did not know that. Tell us, enlighten us, my dear.
So it's going to be called Awkward Archives. And I think what we really learned from this book is that fieldwork is still our crucial way of dealing with situations somehow.
Well, you are anthropologists.
We are, yeah, but we could also take other aspects and also kind of, yeah. But so this book is being done with the framework of the archives project of the Haus der Kulturen der Welt. And what we're actually doing is develop a modular curriculum, which is thus addressed at students, and which kind of gives very, like, based on a German seminar, basically in 7 modules, tries to question ideologies of modernism, actually. So we're trying to question concepts such as nature, alterity, universalism. We're trying to address those questions via specific archives in Berlin, and giving for each archive some sort of different conversations as well with people who actually work in these archives, but also give visual material to kind of illuminate on these questions. Yeah, so.
And again, I think one thing that we learned from this book was really that dealing with book formats is important for us. I think to push for this book to be open access, to push for us to have the right to reshuffle the material was absolutely fundamental. I mean, quite frankly, again, we're just shocked by capitalist publishing practices and, that really just cater to large libraries and so on. And this book is being developed with Archive Publishing House, with Chiara Figone, who's really not just working infrastructurally with designers that she chooses and works with that are within fields and critically thinking, but also allows for us to come up with all kinds of other interesting ideas, like producing an actual printed book that can also be downloaded in a cheaper Guerilla, I mean, anyway, for free, but in a Guerilla kind of version that you can print on a cheap printer. So you can use this proposal for a semester curriculum and reshuffle it and basically add your own archives that speak towards an analysis of modern ideologies. And awkward, we called it, because we were interested in trying to understand where are the problematic archives, not just the alternatives and the mainstream archives, but the awkward archives that get us to think. And one of those is, for example, the Colonial Neighbors Archive within Savi Contemporary, where we spoke with its manager and curator, Linhan Balatbat Helbok, who describes exactly this understanding of awkwardness by saying, for example, colonial era objects that we find in our cupboards are awkward, problematic objects. And how do we deal with them? Can we exhibit them? Can we show them? Should we destroy them? And so it's through these kinds of conversations that we're unfolding this, and it's really meant to be taught. It's meant to be used. I think this is another lesson perhaps to learn from this. We want these books to instigate something.
Oh, wonderful! I'm actually very, very excited about the idea of this book, and I can't wait till I can download it. And that is mainly because I think archives, our archive, the archive of the Ethnological Museum, will be the most important object of this institution. So that's one point. And the second one is, in my previous life, when I was lecturing at the Amsterdam School of the Arts, we also reflected a lot about being in an archive, and what does archive and museum have in common and also not in common, and that those two are so interlinked. And every time I say this to people, say, yeah, but the archive, and you know, I sort of both know both words, are like, So I'm very happy that you from the museum now dive into the archive, which I think is such an interesting organism, and unfortunately not enough appreciated yet, but you will make a difference. Of course, we have to reflect upon the question of Beatrice, because Beatrice doesn't only ask very interesting questions, but Beatrice is part of our cooperation, and good to have you with us here tonight, Beatrice. I know you were, of course, or are of course watching, but that you also write a question that is marvelous. Could you elaborate a little what role, functions, exhibitions could have for this project, in terms of means, as you write? What is their specific relation, also in difference to writing?
Okay, maybe I'll begin, because I'm always struck by something which, by Henrietta Licci's wonderful work and her analyses of exhibitions, but also by something that I always associate with her and her article, The Poetics and Politics of Exhibition Making, which is that exhibitions are three-dimensional narratives. And I think if we think of exhibitions as three-dimensional narratives, and writing perhaps as a two-dimensional narrative, well, we could consider a book basically also a three-dimensional iteration of writing, then they speak with one another. And that is not to negate the differences between three-dimensional and two-dimensional writing, but it's to say that we are constantly creating narratives. And I think that's something which is so fundamental, that exhibitions, books, institutions, they are narratives for how we think. They establish certain kinds of directions, they give sense. This is one aspect. The other aspect, however, and this was really one of the reasons actually, and we elaborate on this in the introduction, that we chose interviews with curators, was the observation that the field of curation has become so discursive, and so much about writing, and that of course curators use, and this is a point that Margareta always makes in our conversations about this, use more and more interviews as ways of speaking about their practice. The discursivization, as it were, of curatorial practice is not just a sort of a secondary form, but I think is really part of curating, of exhibition making.
And I think another point that is crucial is that also the collections actually, so the objects themselves say something else than a text does. And I think that objects still have a different presence than a book does. And especially the kinds of collections that we are talking about here, they have such diverse and difficult and interesting and fascinating stories within them that are much more difficult, I think, to translate into a text than they actually do when they're there themselves. Yeah. So I think also curators are some curators are also object lovers in a way, and also have this kind of fetishism sometimes with regards to their collections. And I think that's also, there's a reason behind that. And I think that's also something that, yeah, does a big difference with regards to writing and exhibiting.
And what for me, and that is for, I mean, this is now my coming out in the sense of love, is why I like making exhibitions so much, or now at the moment providing spaces so they can be made, because I'm much more in another role, is that for me you leave one fundamental part of the equation out, namely people gather in these spaces. It's conversations happen in these spaces because people visit, subjects come, and then I would say that our objects are most of the time subjects themselves, but it's not only this three-dimensional space, but it's also a space where all the time something else is happening, because the set of people that are there constantly happens. It constantly changes, because it's different when you go alone in a space or you are there with other people. And every time something else, you know, it's always a new and another story, and I find that so fascinating. And that is for me actually one of the major reasons why I like doing so much what I do. It's shall we have a last question? Because there was a first question. A big hooray to the one who raised the first question or typed the first question, but there should also be a big hooray for the last question. Anna Karpenko, thank you so much for raising the questions. Do you see the possibility of non-Anthropocene anthropology in your project of trans anthropology? ? Wow, that's a deep one. Taking into account all the surrealist mood of that term, and maybe also a bit the dystopic moods of that term.
I mean, it's very interesting. Thank you, Anna, for this question. I remember we debated for a long time about a particular footnote in the book that I just was just looking up again, because of course there are such incredibly important and not just dystopian debates about the post-human. Obviously, also this Persona exhibition really asked the question of, you know, a robotic world or artificial intelligence. And of course, the more than human world, which is obviously incredibly important. And I think, you know, if we speak about discursive environments and people meeting, obviously we shouldn't forget that the spiritual realm, the active matter realm, all of these.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe because it brings it back to Rabinau in some ways, who's not just the only reference, but in some ways helped us think.
We are talking about the non-Anthropocene, and our internet or our connection is getting worse. That is a pity. That is a pity. I hope we'll manage to get new contact with Berlin. because it's Dresden calling into Leipzig, calling into to Berlin. Maybe that is one Bundesland too far, maybe. That is a pity. Now I have to improvise, but that doesn't really matter. You're back. You're back on track. Good.
Something
more than spiritual matter that interfered in something.
Yeah, I also thought this is so Freudian. The minute we talk about the non-Anthropocene, the digital leaves us, or at least makes the noise. So yeah.
I
Do
think
you want to end your beautiful thought?
Yeah, we just wanted to end on this note, basically, that, you know, we are in an emergent moment in which certain kinds of discussions, problems trouble the present. And it's quite clear, based on the discussions that people initiate about new terms, post-trans, trans, etc., that we're grappling with new concepts, not just concepts, but modes of grasping and inquiring and dealing with the present. And we haven't really found necessarily the right tools or the right strategies, the right modes of narrating, the right institutions to deal with these pressing issues. And then the more than human is one of those. And I think that's really why we wanted to leave it open a little bit and to say, let's embrace this moment of discussion. Let's embrace this moment also of confusion and of troubling, because this is the moment where different concepts, ideas, tools will emerge from.
We will also have on the 2nd of December 8 robots. They're called Ellipse, named after Eva Lips, very important Leipzig anthropologist. Had to flee during the Nazi period to the States and then came back. Was also very important for GDR ethnology. So it's also, you know, a tribute to our GDR heritage as a museum institution. And these robots will, it looks like a tablet on a Segway, but it is very top notch. And we hope that people can go through the exhibitions and also criticize us. And also, of course, go into our storages and work with the colleagues, and not only communities of representatives of communities, but also others and scholars or people who are just interested. And I'm very curious how that will change our perspective of museums and doing museums. But that was, of course, not the question. It was more an advertisement insert to make a bit of advertisement for our museum. My dears, the last content question to you both is there something that we forgot to talk about? Is there something that you still want to reflect upon?
Too much to do now.
Yeah.
Many things.
I think we're very happy that we're going to be able to discuss and deepen these conversations tomorrow as part of a more intimate conversation with the students.
Yeah, that would be so much fun. I'm looking forward to that. Yeah.
I think the only thing to be said is a warm thank you. And also to all of those that were participating and wrote, we're really grateful, and we look forward to continuing this discussion.
Definitely.
In another iteration.
Yeah. Maybe if you do your tour, then all the people in the chat will come back again, and then we'll have another. It will be a totally different conversation, and I will be then on the chat, and it will, you know, it's a corpus that will continue to grow. It's almost a Talmudic conversation on anthropological, the anthropological and the anthropological practice. It was fun. It was fun to, as always, but it was fun. Of course, we would have liked it, I think, all of us, when we would be here, and it, you know, it would have been an open. But at least people could jump in this chat. People did, and I'm very grateful for that. Super. And let us continue the conversation on so many levels and in so many different contexts. Thank you so much. I never had a Zoom before where the two people I sort of had a conversation with were on the same screen. But that felt that felt very natural, and actually much more a conversation than maybe when you were on different screens and in different living rooms. So I'm grateful for that. And thank you so much, dear audience, for being with us tonight, or maybe watching this at another moment in time, which is of course also one of the beautiful advancements of these kinds of technologies, that everything is so much more accessible, like the book. And I will ask Jonas and Margarethe tomorrow how much more downloads have been since tonight, and maybe it are 25,075 downloads tonight, still counting. My dears, enjoy, have a good evening, and we see each other tomorrow in one of the most interesting cities in Europe at the moment, namely Leipzig.
We look forward to that. See you then.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.